Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Bet. For those of you who were on last week, we began Melakhim Bet with the end of Eliyahu and the very beginning of Elisha. And tonight we're going to focus on Elisha primarily tonight. So tonight is going to be Elisha part 1, and I'll be with you again next week for Elisha part 2, as Elisha's life spans a number of chapters in the beginning of Melakhim Bet. So we're going to cover most of his acts, the miracles, the stories over the next 2 weeks. So before we kind of dive into Elisha and some of the stories, we're going to focus tonight. I'm going to kind of think about tonight as thirds. So we're going to spend about a third of our time, or this tonight, on the story of Elisha and the Shunammite woman. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about Elisha and Aram, and that's going to kind of be part 2 and 3. Elisha and Aram, whether it's the general or the battle at the end as well. So that's what we're going to cover this evening. Before we dive into some of the stories, just a little bit of a brief background to Elisha. Right, so you may have been introduced to Elisha last week in some of the readings and some of the shir last week. But Elisha essentially is the chosen prophet for Eliyahu. But at the same time, Elisha could not be any more different than Eliyahu. Right? Eliyahu does these massive miracles, does these moments of power. Think of Har Carmel. He's taken up fiery chariot to Shemayim. Elisha, on the other hand, if you've seen through some of the miracles that you may have read about this week, many of them are very small. They're for a person or 2 people, a town, right? They're very individualized, which kind of differentiates him from Eliyahu, who's much more on a grand scale. Also, Eliyahu is the zealous one, right? Eliyahu is quite zealous. He's often compared to Pinchas, maybe the same person. Elisha is much more of a kind personality, much more caring, really cares about the downtrodden, and we'll see that tonight as well. Elisha travels. He goes from place to place. You'll notice that many of the stories take place all throughout northern Israel, right? The Shunammite woman takes place in a town called Shunem, right? All throughout the mostly northern Israel. He's traveling around to do these miracles. Elisha was a prophet for over 60 years, right? His stories span many, many, many kings of Israel. So he had a very long life and was very busy during that time period. And the stories are not necessarily chronological. So that's just something to keep in mind. There might be themes that pair certain stories together, but it's not necessarily chronological. And in some places we know for sure it's not chronological. So with that introduction, and again, feel free to chime in at any point if you have any questions or comments. We're going to now jump into the first story I want to focus on tonight, which is Elisha and the woman of Shunam, or the Shunammite woman. So I've brought for you parts of the text. I can share it in the chat again for those of you who did not get it in the email, but I'll also share it as well from on the screen, but I'll kind of jump between the two. Just see if I can pull that up for you. Elisha, so it's going to be in the chat right now. And then I'll also share my screen in a moment. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Just gonna zoom in a little bit. We have a lot of text this evening. Don't be afraid that the source sheet is a little bit lengthy, but I'm not going to read it all inside. Instead of just skipping every verse here and there, I just kind of put some verses in, even though we're not going to be reading them all inside. But I wanted to just have it all in front of us. Okay, so we're going to pick up in chapter 4. We're starting with verse 8, chapter 4, which is where we start with Elisha and the story of the Shunammite woman. So we're going to be thinking about a couple questions that I want us to think about, right? Many of you have already seen this text. So even before we dive into the story, just very briefly, essentially, Elisha becomes acquainted with this woman. She houses him, and eventually he blesses her and gives her some sort of miracle to allow her to have a child. Child falls ill, dies, and Elisha essentially brings her back to life. So just overarching questions before we dive into the story is, why is there a child that is being brought into this world in such a miraculous way, who is then going to be mysteriously taken at a young age? right? So we know stories where there's some sort of miracle involved to have a child. Yitzchak, right? Classic. Avram and Sarai were very old. But here, a child is given and then a child is taken. Not so clear what that means for the prophet, right? Well, how does that help him? How does that further his agenda, right? He was able to bring somebody into the world and then they left the world and then he brought them back. So that's one thing I want us to think about. And especially during this narrative, but every single narrative tonight, there's one other character who is central. Who is that other character? Feel free to call out. Who's that other character? Or you can put it in the chat.
Gehazi.
Gehazi is Elisha's, servant, Elisha's number two. You could almost think of him perhaps as, Eliyahu had Elisha, so Elisha has Gehazi, but it's not so clear that he's a prophet. He's more of a helper, but he becomes a main figure in many of these stories. And what I want us to think about as well, especially for this first story, is who is the main character of the story? Why does that matter, right? So we have the Shunammite woman, but then we have Elisha. So I would think maybe the Shunammite woman or maybe Elisha is the main character, is the protagonist in the story. But if we switch gears and think of it through the lens of Gehazi and perhaps what the Tanakh is trying to tell us about him, it changes our perspective ever so slightly and may help us understand why this story is in the Tanakh. Okay, without further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so we're told in the very beginning of the story, verse 8, that there was this town called Shunem, and there was a great woman, the Shunammite woman, and Elisha would dine by her quite often, and eventually she understood that he was a Ish Elokim, right? He's a man of God, Kadoshu, and so essentially she says, Nasena aliyat kir ktana. Let's give him like a little apartment, right? Remember, Elisha travels from place to place, so she decided that when you're in this town, you're going to stay with my family. So she's very kind. And so he goes and he stays there. So look at verse 12. Vayomer el Gehazi na'aro. So Elisha calls to Gehazi and he says, Kra l'shunami tazo, call her. Vaikra la v'tamud lefanav. So she stood before him. Vayomer lo, and he said, Emor na, say to her, you've been very careful with us. You've been very proper with us, right? What can I do for you? How can I help you? Right? You've done such kindness to me. How can I repay you? So essentially, Elisha wants to understand what she can do, what he can do for her. Excuse me. And so what happens? Who responds? Did the Isha respond? No. Who responds? Gehazi. Vayomer. Umala sotla. What can we do for her? Vayomer Gehazi. So Gehazi responds, Aval ben einla v'isha zaken. Right? She has no son. V'isha, her husband, is old. So essentially, what we have here is Elisha says, how can I help you? And Gehazi responds. So that already should strike an interesting note for us, because we're going to notice throughout this story and others, often Gehazi steps in to give his opinion on the matter, right? He is the Eved, the minister, the protege of Elisha. But often we need to be asking ourselves, is his suggestion, is his advice warranted? And is it the right, proper advice, right? If you were to read these stories and not think through that lens, I think we might be missing one of the major key points that the stories are going to be trying to teach us as we go through them. Also note, who does Elisha not talk to directly? The Isha. And, you might say, oh, maybe Sneas, he doesn't want to talk directly to a woman. Throughout Elisha's career, he almost never speaks directly to another person. It's funny. Elisha is the man of the people. He does these amazing miracles for people, right? One of the miracles we just skipped was when he creates so much wealth for a woman. He does all these miracles, but almost always through Gehazi. It almost sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps through Aharon, or Moshe Rabbeinu through Yehoshua. He himself does not directly interact with people, which is a fascinating kind of addition to the story. So Vayomer krala, vaykrala vatamu bapetach. So the woman appears before Elisha. So he says, Vayomer, lamoed hazeh, right? We've heard this before. Avram, right? Vayomer, lamoed hazeh kait chaya, right? You're going to have a baby, you're going to have a child. Chovek et ben, you'll have a child. Vatomer el Adoni ish Elohim, al techazev b'shivchatecha. She says, don't lie to me. Meaning, if this is going to happen, this is going to happen, but don't trick me. Vatara isha vateled ben, right? She has a son. Right? Think of Shmuel, all these people. Just like Elisha said. Vayigdal hayeled, he grows up. And here's where it's a little strange. It says, Vayete el aviv elakotrim. He goes out to work with the reapers. So why is it telling us this? Right? It could be that it's just trying to tell us he's older. He's maybe 10 years old. He's grown up a little bit. He's able to go work with his father. Or maybe this is hinting as to what happened that caused his death. Right? It's not clear, but right almost after this, verse 19, Vayomer el aviv, Roshi, Roshi, my head. So something happens through, it's like a workplace, and he's going to sue the workers, the employer. Something happens at work. Vayomer el aviv, Roshi, Roshi, my head is killing me. Vayomer el hanar, sayu elimo. Bring him to his mother. So this could be looked in two ways. Either it's very positive, right? Bring him to his mother because she'll heal him, or it's like, get him out of my sight. Two different ways to look at it. So what happens? He's brought to his mother. So she stays with her son while his head is in so much pain. 6 verses earlier, the prophet has given us a blessing for this woman, and now he's taken away. Before I move on, I just want to open it up. Does anybody have a theory as to what's going on? Why does the prophet bring somebody into this world who's going to die 5 verses later?
Can resurrect him.
Resurrection, right? We're going to see resurrection take place in this story. So perhaps part of the miracle is that Elisha has the ability to give life and somebody dies, and then to bring back from the dead. So that's quite a miracle. So maybe resurrection is the underlying key factor here, right? We want Elisha to be seen as a man who can resurrect the dead. He's done quite a number of miracles. This would really top it. Any other theories as to
why? It's interesting that just because he's born by virtue of a miracle doesn't guarantee what his fate will be and what his life will be entirely. And I think there's a very important underlying message in that you shouldn't believe just because this one good thing happens, suddenly it becomes the basis of exactly what's going to be forever and ever. And so there's a notion that there's this still ongoing level of uncertainty in what constitutes our lives and our faiths.
Yeah, no, I think that's another extremely important point, which expands beyond the prophet. It's really true for everyone's life, right? We've all been brought into this world, and we don't know at what point we're going to be taken from this world. And it's up to us as to what we're going to do in the interim. So it's not only for the prophet, but it's also, I think, for every single person when we're given life from God. So I think both of those are true. It's interesting when thinking about the prophet's ability to not only give life the first time around, but in a moment we'll see him do it a second time. Was the prophet permitted to do so? Or think about Avram when he found out that he was having a son. Right, so who comes? Angels, Melakhim come, and they tell Sarah and Avram that they're going to have a child. Did anybody come to Elisha and tell him that she was going to have a child? So one approach is to say, well, that very moment, he had a prophecy. So it was ordained at that moment that she would have a child. So Elisha was now announcing it. There is a second approach, which is to actually look at Elisha in a negative light here, which is to say, who suggested that we give her a child? Gehazi. And what happens? Elisha buys into Gehazi's kind of lottery. He says, give him a child. Right? Gehazi is like this enamored student who looks at his teacher and assumes that his teacher is Superman. Elisha is quite up there. But essentially, Gehazi talks Elisha into it. Elisha says, you're going to have a child. And at that point, some approaches, Mefarshim assume, God's hands were tied. Right? Elisha, the prophet of Israel, has announced that this woman will have a child. So God has to make it happen. But God does not have to make it happen in such a way that the child will make it through, meaning this child should never have been born, according to certain approaches. So there's different ways of looking at the story. I just wanted to give you both approaches here, and you can look at it in either way. Okay, let's jump back into the story here. So what happens? The child dies. Vayamot. He died. It's not unambiguous, right? It doesn't say, he was sick and he fell asleep, right? You could argue Vayamos. He died. She puts him on the bed of Elisha in the attic. It kind of sounds like the Teva of Noach a little bit. Hashem closes the door. They're locked in there, and he or she does something very similar, which is kind of interesting. I don't necessarily know what that means, but I just noted it, especially because we're coming off of Parshas Noach. But essentially, why is she placing him on the prophet's bed?
His responsibility.
Yeah, he's the miracle worker. So if he's not home, maybe his bed has superpowers. So essentially, she puts him on the bed because maybe there's some sort of zuchus involved here. And so what happens? She puts him there. She calls her husband and she says, I need to speak essentially to Elisha. I need to speak to the man of God. And this is where it's quite interesting, where we learn a little bit about how Jews interacted with prophets. Vayomer, in verse 23 in the highlight, Madua at holechet, why are you going to him today? Lo chodesh, lo Shabbos, vatomer shalom. Meaning, when did people visit the prophet? And this is true, actually. Chazal talk about this when visiting your Rebbe, right? It's proper to go over the regalim. They would visit the prophet on Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, right? So that's quite interesting. And he says, I'm just going to see how he's doing. It's also unclear if the father knows that the child is dead, right? The father gave the child to the woman, to his wife. She locks him in the attic after he dies, and she doesn't tell us whether or not the husband knows. So it could be that she is trying to hide from her husband the fact that their miracle child has died in her arms. You could see, we could delve into this on a more deeper psychological level, like perhaps the guilt that she feels that she brought this child into this world. The child has died on her lap, and her husband maybe at this point doesn't even know. She gets onto a donkey. Avram, all these people go on donkeys. They go, and she goes to meet the prophet who's at Har HaKarmel, right? That's the famous place of Eliyahu, but Elisha spends some time there right outside of Haifa. And so what happens at this point? Look in the highlighted verse 26. Ata, now, roots na likrata. She says, Gehazi approaches her and says, I want to speak to the prophet. And so Elisha essentially tells Gehazi, once he finds out that the child is dead, he's going to ask Gehazi to go ahead and find the child, go to the deceased child before Elisha shows up. So we have to kind of unpack this. Elisha is going to ask his servant to find out what is going on with the child in the home. So it's almost like Elisha is sending his servant off to do his biddings. Why isn't Elisha going? It's a little strange, and we'll see here in verse 26 and 27, if you look either in the English or the Hebrew. So Gehazi says, I'll go, but essentially, I'm not sure this is going to work out so well. So essentially, Gehazi goes ahead, and we'll see in a moment. Elisha tells him, right, in the English, for example, gird up thy loins and take my staff. Elisha tells him, take my staff. Think about Moshe Rabbeinu, take my staff, go do a miracle. I want you to take my staff, go to the home, and through the staff, the Mefarshim trying to figure out what's with this holy staff. Essentially, the notion that this staff was involved could make the miracle take place. So Elisha commands his servant to bring a staff so that the child will come back to life. So essentially, Elisha doesn't have to get involved at all. It could be seen as Elisha trying to allow him to take responsibility. He was the one who suggested we bring this child into the world in the first place. Now that the child's dead, so Gehazi says, Elisha, go ahead, and I want you to fix it for us. Okay, so let's see what happens here. The Mefarshim, by the way, Chazal in the Medrash, not even the Mefarshim, the Medrash teaches us that Gehazi, when he's told to go all the way to go meet, I'll just stop the share for just a moment, to go and meet the boy in the home, the Chazal teach us that he tarried along the way, and he poked fun at the fact that he had this staff, this miracle staff, that was going to supposedly bring back the child to life. Essentially, Gehazi did not believe that it was possible, which is why when he shows up with the staff, nothing happens, which is why Elisha eventually is called in. So Chazal are picking up in the interim and noting that Gehazi is not exactly the most kosher character out there. He's kind of in it for himself, and he's not quite ready to perform miracles on behalf of Elisha. But let's look back inside. So what happens? Look at verse 31 in the bold. So Gehazi avar lifnehem bayasem et hamishenet. He puts the staff right up pnei hanar ve'ein kol ve'ein kashev. The nar is not alive. Vayashav likrato vayagelo lemor lo hekitza nar. He's not awake, and he's not becoming awakened by my staff. So Elisha comes, right? He calls in the big guns to finally get the miracle working. Vayavo Elisha habayta v'hinei nar met mushkav al mitato. What happens at this point? I think many of us, myself included, when I was thinking about this story, so what does everyone remember about this story? The famous kind of image of him doing CPR to this nar, but how does the story actually start? Vayavo vayiskor hadelet ba'ad shnehem. He closes the door behind them. Vayitpalel el Hashem. The prophet prays first. So it's important to note that prayer precedes the act itself. And Chazal, Mefarshim note that the reason that he prayed was in essence for God to give Rachamim, and what comes next was not actually necessary to bring the child back to life. What's he do? Vayal vayishkav al yed. He literally goes on top of the child, vayasem piv al piv, just as God blows life into us. So the prophet, who is the man of God, blows life into this child, einav el einav, like face to face, v'kapav al kapav, vayigar alav vayachem b'sahel, and the body of the child started to warm up through the breath, through the life that Elisha shared. Mefarshim note that what's actually going on here is the fact that he's kind of giving him this sort of CPR was in order to limit the extent of the miracle. What do I mean by that? Often Chazal, often when we have a miracle take place, we want it to be as close to the natural way of doing something as possible, right? So yeah, he could have done a miracle by just davening, but essentially by breathing life into him, he actually limits the miracle by showing that, normally if somebody needs air, so that's how we'd give it to them. So even though it's been many hours and that's not how it normally would work, we want it to look as closely related to what a miracle or what a natural way of bringing somebody back to life would actually look like. So that's some approaches as to what's really going on here. Elisha brings the child back to life, and the child is now alive. The story essentially comes to a close, and that's the end of the story. The woman thanks Elisha, and that's the end of the story. Okay, going back to some of our earlier questions, why was he brought into this world? Why did he then die? What's the whole purpose of all of this? So one way to look at it is to see this story through the lens of Gehazi. Gehazi made a mistake by looking at his prophet, his teacher, as this miracle man who could do anything he wanted. So Gehazi twisted his leader, Elisha, into doing something. And then God essentially, the joke's on Gehazi that this is not how it works. You can't just decide to bring somebody into this life. So God essentially says, I'm going to take this person out because this person wasn't supposed to be here in the first place. Gehazi is then tested by bringing the staff. He kind of botches that. And so Elisha has to come in at the end as well. On the one hand, it shows Gehazi in this kind of place where he's unable to himself perform miracles. But on the other hand, Elisha has now brought somebody back to life for the first time in human history. So on the one hand, it's kind of perhaps punishing Gehazi in some sense, but on the other hand, it actually builds up the character of Elisha. Okay, I want to pull up a source for you as we concluded this first story, which is a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. What's the Mishnah in Sanhedrin teach us? At the very bottom here. We've seen this Mishnah before. Shlosha Melakhim, 3 kings and 4 hedyotot, 4 non-kings. Ein lahem chelek la'olam haba, have no part in the world to come. We've talked about the kings before, examples of people in Melakhim. Who are the Harba Hedyotot? Bilam, Doeg, in the stories of David, Achitofel in the stories of David, Gehazi. So we're going to see that while Gehazi began as this kind of close confidant of Elisha, and he continues to be, he ends up in many ways being the thorn in Elisha's side. He's the Achilles heel to Elisha, because Elisha is tempted to do certain things that he should not have done, but Gehazi kind of tempts him into doing it. And we're going to now see that also in the next kind of two narratives that we're going to look at. Before we move on to the next narrative, just want to open it up to any questions or comments on the Isha Shunamit story.
Rabbi, that's quite a list that Gehazi got dumped with. I'm a little surprised. I don't know if the punishment fits the crime exactly.
So we haven't finished with Gehazi yet. So maybe with just this particular story, I would agree with you. But I think what we'll see is that Gehazi will continue to do things that are inappropriate for anybody, but perhaps especially somebody in a place of power. And maybe that's actually
well, he went on to try and enrich himself. I've read it, but I'm saying it's still, in the other cases, it was damnation of the people of Israel on some of that. This is not quite on that grand scale.
Yeah, no, I understand that. It's certainly more individual. It's more about him himself and not about affecting others. I do agree to that. But it's interesting a little bit with Gehazi is we'll see the story when he becomes a tsarat. And when we talk about tsarat, so tsarat, Torah even describes tsarat as almost being like death. And we'll see that perhaps he never was essentially cured of that tsarat, which essentially meant that he was damned in this world and in the world to come. So we'll look into that kind of angle as well. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I mean, I find it a bit striking that no members of this family have names.
That is, their names don't seem to matter, right? Because it's about them.
It's a pretty long story and we never get any of their names. I just find that interesting.
Yeah. There are a number of stories like that in Shoftim as well. And usually when we don't get names, it's either because the characters aren't important for us in terms of who they are, but also it could just be highlighting the other people in the story, Gehazi and Elisha. But that's a very valid point. Okay, so let's move on to the next story. So we're now going to jump. This is chapter 4. We're now going to jump to chapter 5. And we're going to look at chapter 5, a particular story, which is the story of Elisha and Naaman. So who is Naaman? Naaman is one of the generals, captains, essentially, of the Aramean, the Aram's military, and he's the enemy of the Jewish people. And yet, he's going to turn toward the prophet. What's the story going to be highlighting for us? What's the story going to be teaching us? What are the lessons that are going to emerge from the story? I think we'll actually be able to hone in on them in just the first couple of verses. So I'm going to pull up those first verses, and I think you'll be able to see very clearly what the purpose of these stories are very early on. Okay, verse number 1. Who's Naaman? Naaman is the Sar Tzva Melech Aram, the captain of the military of Aram. Who is he? He's an Ish Gadol Lifnei Adonav Uneso Panim Kivon Natan Hashem Shual Aram. Right? God has given victory to Aram. He's the general. So furthermore, V'ha'isha Yagibor Chayil, he was strong man, Mitzora, who was also stricken with tsaras. He was a leper. Verse number 1 does something fascinating, which you don't see kind of when you look at it the first time, but if you focus in on it, what does it do in each section? The first section being Naaman through the last line, and then V'ha'ish until the end. What it does is it starts by naming Naaman as a man of power, and then it subsequently tells us that he's actually not as powerful as we thought. Who's Naaman? The captain of the host of the king of Aram, who was a great man. Meaning, so he's a big shot, but there's a bigger shot. There's somebody who's bigger and greater than him. He's an Ish Gibor. He has Tzarat, right? So on the one hand, he's of the top tier in society, but he's also one of the lowest in society. And often somebody who's actually closest to the king can often be demanded to do things much more, right? The king's not going to demand some random person in the street to do something for him. So often the, number 2, number 3, number 4, they actually have to feel the burden of their master, the king. Second verse, Ve'aram yatzu gedudim vayishbu me'eretz Yisrael, right? They brought captives from Israel. Who did they bring? A na'arak tana, a small, young Israelite maiden. Vatahi lifnei eshet na'aman. Again, we have a small maiden, a Jewish woman. So she's Jewish, so that essentially makes her important for us, but she becomes essentially a slave to Naaman. Verse number 3, Vatomer el gevirta. She says to her master, Achila Adoni. She says, excuse me, but lifnei hanavi asher b'shomron az yasefo tu mitzarato. I see that your husband, essentially, the general of Aram, is stricken with Sarat. If you want him to be saved, bring him to the prophet in Samaria. That would be Elisha. What's going on here is the smallest person in society, the most downtrodden person in society, has the answer, has the key to success. It's like the jester, right? The person that nobody cares about often is the wisdom in the story. Think of a Shakespeare play, right? Often has the most consequential advice. And here we see it with the Na'ara Tana. So what happens? So he says, listen, I heard that there's this prophet in the land of Israel. He can heal you. Vayomer Melech Aram. So the king, it gets all the way up to the king, and he says, I want to heal the general. So he sends to the king of Israel, right? Not to the prophet, but to the king, right? Diplomacy has been in the news recently. There are certain channels in which diplomatic relations take place. Kings talk to other kings. Kings don't go directly to the prophet of another kingdom. It's not appropriate to do so. So, except for maybe in the story of Bilam, but that's another story. So he speaks to the king of Israel, and he says to the king of Israel, this is amazing. He says, look, I want to pay you to heal my general, right? That's what he says. I want to pay you to heal my general. So he brings him before him, and he says, I want you to heal him. What happens? The king of Israel, Vayihi ki kromelech Yisrael tasefer, he reads the request, Vayikra begadav. He tears Kriya. The king of Israel tears Kriya. Right? The kings of Israel were not always the most upright citizens, upright kings, but nevertheless, he understood something important was happening here. And something important from an educational perspective was critical at this very moment. Why? The king of Aram thinks that the king of Israel has the ability to heal people from Sarat. And the king of Israel tears Kriya because he's so ashamed that word got out there that a king of Israel has this ability. Absolutely not. The prophet does. And what he's pointing out to the king of Aram is that us, so the Jewish people, we have different, we have kings and we have prophets. They're very different. Vayomer ha'elohim ani lahamitu lahachiot. Can I take away and bring to life? And what is this? Obviously, this just happened after the story of the Isha Shunamit. Elisha essentially does that, right? He can bring to life, and the child dies. So it's a question of how did the child die? But essentially, that's in the realm of the prophet. So let me go get the prophet because he's the one who can actually heal, your general. So finally, Elisha hears that the king had torn Kriya, so he realizes the king realizes the great power of the prophet. So he says, Lama karata begadecha. Why did you tear Kriya? We thought tearing Kriya was a measurement of the righteousness of the king of Israel. Right? He showed how powerful he is, but at the same time, how righteous he can be by noting that that's not something that's in his realm. But nevertheless, he says, almost like Kohelet would say, there's a time for everything and there's a time for nothing, right? You have time for different things in life. Lama karata begadecha, you shouldn't have done that. Essentially, bring him to the priest, bring him to the prophet, Ki yesh navi b'Yisrael. It's kind of fascinating what happens here because, we thought the king was righteous in that moment, but he says, no, you should have, in that very moment, just admit it. I don't do it. Bring him to the prophet. And so essentially they go to the prophet. And here's where things get interesting. In Aramean culture, if you want to lose your tzarat or you want to be healed, so there's certain practices that are done. But in Israel, we have other ways in which we get people healed. So what does he ask him to do? In the highlight, says, and I'll just do this outside for a moment, says Elisha, I want you to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. He scoffs at him. He says, are you kidding me? I came all the way from Damascus, from Aram, to go dip in the River Jordan. So he's incensed. And essentially, Elisha then has to say to him, listen, I don't know what you do up in Aram, but this is how things are done down here. If you want it to work, good. If not, you can go home with your tzarat. And that's essentially what he tells him. And essentially, he eventually goes and dips in the Jordan. But was it Elisha who convinced him to dip in the Jordan? No. Who convinces him? Look in the pasuk. I'll pull it right back up for us.
It was his sar who accompanied him.
It was essentially his number twos. It was people, not him himself. It was people who were below him in society. Once again, you see how somebody in the inferior position of power actually saves the day, actually has the last word, has the wisdom to share. And so we see here, Vaikshu Avadav, his servants come up to him and say, listen, go and do it. And he does it, and he's healed. Kivsar na'ar katon. It's interesting. It says that his skin became like a child's skin, vayitar, and he became pure. Again, we see this notion that this great general has tzarat. Finally, he listens to the most downtrodden in his society, this small Jewish girl, and his servants as well. And he now becomes a nar katon. He becomes, young, pure again, because he listens to the prophet of Israel and to the other lower people in his society. And what happens at this moment is he recognizes God. And this perhaps is the reason we have moments like this, right? Elisha is a miracle man, is a miracle worker, is an Ish Elohim. And he does it for moments like this, because what happens, it says the general in the highlight, who is the true king? Who is the true God? The God of Israel. Now take a blessing, maybe take a gift from me, because I'm thanking you for what you've done for me. So essentially, the prophet is able to convince through his actions that the true God in this world is the God of Israel. But look at verse 17 and tell me what is going on here. So what does Naaman say? Naaman's now been healed. He believes in Hashem. Everything is good. Vayomer Naaman. He says, this is what Naaman says. V'lo yutana la'avdecha masatzemet pradim adama. It says, I pray thee, let there be given to thy servant 2 mules burden of earth, meaning lots of dirt that mules can carry back to my temples. And he notes the names of the temples in the next verse, so that I can bring it to Beit Rimon, right? Beit Rimon is an idolatrous place. I want to bring the earth from here back to my temples, so that I will bow down in those temples, right? Certainly it's idolatrous, but he says, no, I'm only bowing down because the king is going to make me. But when I bow down and when I offer sacrifices, I'm doing it for the God of Israel. Why does he ask for dirt? Is one request from the prophet of Israel, who just healed him from tzarat. Would you ask for dirt?
Maybe he thinks the earth is holy.
Admat Kodesh, so it's holy earth. Anyone want to add to that?
Well, he's going to take that earth and he's going to build an altar.
He's going to build an altar, and we know that the
So
altar.
he's servicing, in his way, servicing God.
Exactly. We know that the Mizbeach, the Torah tells us, not in the Beis HaMikdash, but in the Mishkan, the Mizbeach is Mizbeach Adama. You put the earth in the Mizbeach, and that's how you build the Mizbeach. But what's fascinating is you read carefully into the words of Naaman. If you look very carefully, I'm just going to pull it right back up because it's fascinating what he says. The king, the God, Hinena yadati ki ein Elohim b'chol haaretz ki im b'Yisrael. How did I translate that for you? There is no God in the world except the God of Israel. That is not how it should be translated. There is no God on earth except for in the land of Israel. He assumes that God is based in a particular spot on earth. God has to be confined to a particular terrain that is the land of Israel. Ki im b'Yisrael. In the land of Israel is where God is found. So why do I need to bring dirt from Israel?
Because that's God.
God is found in this land. I can't live here. I work for somebody else. So I must be brought elsewhere, right? So we as Jews know that, especially all throughout, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, and obviously all throughout Jewish history, right? Although the land of Israel is a special location, and certainly the Shekhinah rests in Yerushalayim, the land of Israel is holy, right? God does not only kind of dwell there, essentially. God exists much, broader than the land of Israel itself. But that's not so clear in the ancient Near East, right? A God is a God of a certain land. So this is the God of Israel. God of Israel is only found in the land of Israel, which is interesting. Additionally, we actually, not in the same way, but we do things similar, right? Think about a kavura. We often have dirt from the land of Israel. Again, it's not the same, but essentially because we know that this dirt is where resurrection will take place in the land of Israel first. So we kind of put earth from the land of Israel with a mace, often outside the land of Israel, is to say that like there should be a schus of tchias hamesim happening quickly with this person, just like it will happen to Jews in the land of Israel. So we don't do it exactly the way that he did, but it's not as far-fetched as one might make it out to seem. Any thoughts or comments on this story?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, how many tons of Jerusalem stone are imported every year to make altars and walls and synagogues around the United States?
Exactly. It's the same notion. Exactly.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, how did Naaman get tzaras? I thought that was something that was a spiritual disease that's more restricted to Jews.
So
that might have been the source of everything else that happened.
Interesting. So I mean, tzarat is something that the Torah prescribes a solution for in the Torah. And there are reasons why one might get tzarat, but tzarat is not limited to Jews. And this is, I guess, proof of that case, right? He's not Jewish. But nevertheless may have come about for deeds that he did.
No, because it's always described as a disease of the spirit more. It's not just leprosy.
Exactly. That is true. It's more than just that. But if you look at Parshas Mitzorah, right? So on the one hand, that is correct, but it also is very much a dermatological issue, which has spiritual ramifications and layers to it as well. That's how I would say it.
Thank you.
No problem.
I think it reinforces again, though, the ancient concept of how territorial gods are. Look how Naaman interprets it as being so geographically limiting.
Yep, and that's why when the Jews are defeated at the end of Sefer Melakhim and the first temple is destroyed, if your temple is destroyed, it means that the other God destroyed your God. It means that God has abandoned you. You're gone, which is why throughout history, people convert to they're not the religion that conquers them, because that means that their God won, our God lost. Jews stand out as one of the only peoples who don't do that, essentially. And that's why, or at least a minority or majority of Jews continue to keep the faith, essentially, which is why we continue to live as a minority amongst majorities all throughout the world. Exactly. The story continues with Gehazi. Gehazi picks up the story and he chases after the Arameans who are leaving and going back to Aram, right? They've been healed, they're very happy. And he says, hold on. The prophet who originally rejected getting payment wants to be paid. So what's happening now? And Vicky mentioned this, right? Gehazi is trying to get funds brought to him in an improper way, right? He wants to be paid, so he pretends that the prophet has requested it, right? So once again, you see Gehazi doing something inappropriate. Vayomer Gehazi nar Elisha, and they say who he is because that's important. It's kind of like somebody showing up, breaking the law and saying, "Don't worry, I work for so and so." Right? That's not he's like using his authority to get the bribes essentially. And he says, "Listen, I need to get money from you, and can you give me it?" And Naaman is so happy that he was been healed, he gives it to him. And so he pays him back. We're not going to read all of this inside. He pays him back all this money. He's now become rich. But now Gehazi returns to Elisha. And what does Elisha say to him? Elisha says to Gehazi, right? Like, where were you? Where'd you go? I missed you. Right? I wasn't going anywhere. Essentially, he's trying to skirt the issue. But Elisha knows what he did. He says, did you not enrich yourself in an improper way? Right? I work for God. I don't get enriched for doing God's work. Gehazi tries to make money off of it. And what's his punishment? Vitzarat Naaman tidbak becha. The tsaras of Aram, that individual Naaman, who was a negative character in the beginning of the story, ends up becoming a righteous character essentially. Now Gehazi, who we knew all along was conniving, now he gets the tsaras that is due to him, right? Tsaras is something that happens often, think about Lashon Hara as being the classic case, is doing something inappropriate, but it's often something that's behind people's backs, right? You stole behind my back, so now it's going to be shown on your flesh. You're going to wear the sin upon you. It'll be for you, ubizar acha leolam. You and your children forever. This is not just tzarat. This is going to be an inherited tzarat. Milfarav mitzara kashalag. And at that moment, he turned as white as snow. So going back to the questions of like, how bad is Gehazi? So maybe he didn't sin to the same extent as others did. Think about your Ravam ben Nevat, who is the king, one of the kings listed in the Mishnah when it comes to the Melakhim. But perhaps because of his position, he is punished at a greater level. Because I think at least the first two stories we've seen so far, before we just look briefly at the last story, the first two stories are all about essentially an improper use of power, right? Gehazi is the number 2 to Elisha. He twists the arms of Elisha to do a miracle that should probably not have been done according to many Mefarshim. It ends, there's a middle catastrophe of death. Fine, the child is brought back to life to the prophet Elisha, but it probably shouldn't have happened that way in the first place. And then we have these stories, again, a story about a general from Aram who is, not a nice man, essentially. I mean, he's going to destroy the Jewish people, essentially. That's what his aim is to do. And yet it's the underdogs in society who are able to heal him. But Gehazi, who's number 2 in society, ends up being the one who gets punished as well for his sin. So I think part of both of these stories is to show us that people in positions of power, especially Gehazi, right? Gehazi is in a position of power when he makes the wrong decisions and does not admit them. David admits them. That's why he still becomes David Melakhim II. Like he becomes such a great person in our history, in our culture. But Gehazi doesn't, because Gehazi never acknowledges, right? When Elisha points out to him that he's sinned, Gehazi doesn't say, Salachti Aviti, but he doesn't do that. He says, yeah, that's who I am, right? That's what I do. I steal. I bribe. So he gets tsaras. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why he ends up on this list, on the short list of no olam haba. But also, what's it mean not to get olam haba? Often what it means is that you won't get to a place where you recognize that God essentially decides at the end of the day what happens, to each and every one of us. And if you don't recognize it, that it's not about me, if you don't recognize that you should be, acknowledging your sin, so you've taken yourself out of olam haba. Gehazi says, I don't want a part of this. I'm out, right? He's only interested in this world, essentially, is what we're being told. We'll now turn just to the last story, which many of us are familiar with. It's also a Haftorah, which are the four lepers. The four lepers, not leopards, lepers, Saras, Mitzoraim, the four lepers. That would be a whole different story. So essentially, the story picks up, and I'll pull it up in just a moment, but the story picks up with these four individuals, four men who are Mitzoraim. Who are the Mitzoraim in the story? So Chazal tell us that it's Gehazi and his three sons, which is to say, we just finished a story with a Mitzorah. So now we're continuing the story. And why isn't he named? Going back to perhaps what David was talking about with the Ishashman, if you don't get a name, it's because we don't want to give you a name, right? He's lost his ability to be named, right? He's given up his name. He's just the Mitzorah. They are just the Mitzorah. They are the outcasts in society. You don't even get a name, right? That's how you fall so low. And obviously that's how you denigrate a person, is by removing their shame, which gives them who they are, assigns who they are and what they are. So look at the story. We'll look at not all of it inside like we've done the other ones, but we'll look at a couple. Opens up, just importantly, Elisha says, listen, the kingdom is under siege. We're under siege by the Arameans who just acknowledged God. So again, we don't know the chronology of events. Elisha was a prophet for 60 years. So we don't really know. This could have happened many years later, right? So even though, yes, he acknowledged God, but the king said, go attack Israel. So that's what they do. Aram attacks Israel. But nevertheless, Elisha knows through prophecy that even though today is awful because they're under siege, there's no money, and the chapter before talks about this a little bit more, the currency is gone, there's no food, people are starving, people are dying. Nevertheless, Elisha says, listen, machar sa solet b'shekel v'sa saim sa'urim b'shekel b'shar shomron. Essentially, he says flour, everything's going to become very expensive tomorrow, right? So this is like the ancient way of saying it. Tomorrow you're going to wake up and, a carton of milk everything's going to be very expensive, but in a way that means that people have lots of money. So that there's more currency in the economy, not that it's just inflation. Essentially what he's saying is that things are going to be good tomorrow. Things are going to be better tomorrow. And that's why things are going to be good. We're going to have lots of money. Nobody believes him. And we see Vaya'an HaShalish, the captain of the king, says essentially, I don't know if this is going to happen. Okay, so that's the opening story. First two lines kind of set the stage, but now we jump to the Arba'a Anashim. Right, so what's the story? We have the kingdom of Aram is encamped outside of Shomron, outside of the city of Shomron, and they're ready to destroy it. They're ready to destroy the 10 northern tribes of Israel. The Arba'a Anashim Hayu Mitzora'im, but there are these four lepers who are out the gate of the city. They're not allowed in the city, right? Mitzora'im stay outside the city. So these lepers are essentially Chazal tell us Gehazi and his family. They're outside the city walls. And they say the following. And this, going back to the question of like he gave up on the world to come, if we read this as Gehazi, it works perfectly. Imamarnu navo ha'ir, if we will go into the city and there's famine in the city, v'hara'av ba'ir, v'matnu sham, we're going to die there. V'im yashavnu po, if we stay here, we're also going to die, right? It sounds like you could have like a Yiddish, parable over here, right? Either way, we're going to be killed. So we may as well enjoy, which is what he says, which essentially is kind of comical, but on the other hand, is not exactly the proper way to look at life. So they say, let's at least go to the Machane Aram and see maybe they won't kill us. Maybe they'll take us captive and we'll survive and live elsewhere. So they go. Vayakuma b'neshef, they go in twilight to the Machane Aram. V'hinei ein ish sham, ein sham ish. There's nobody there, absolutely nobody. So the previous chapter went into a little bit more detail, but essentially a miracle takes place. They think that a massive army is approaching, and they flee. The entire Aramean army flees before the city and goes away. And they leave all of their armor, their weapons, their money, all behind. So what do? They get there, And they see, and it explains in verse 6, essentially they realize that they think they're going to be crushed. They think that the Hittites and the Egyptians are helping the Jews, which wasn't the case, but nevertheless they thought that was happening because they heard all this noise. They flee, they leave all of their belongings. Go down here. What happens? The Mitzoraim appear. Nobody's home. So what do? They essentially take items. Now, what are they doing? Are they stealing? Not exactly stealing. These people have fled. They're not coming back. But what do? They take items and they vayatminu. They hid them. Why are they hiding these items that they're stealing? Who cares?
I think they're hiding gold and silver.
From whom?
From the army left behind.
So they're hiding it because, yes, exactly. So they're getting the things that were hidden. But what they'll do in a moment, look at the next verse. They say, "Vayomru isha re'ehu." The men say, "Lo chen anachnu osim." What we're doing isn't good. Hayom hazeh yom besorahu. Today's a good day, meaning God has given us all these amazing things. We're the first people to walk into the camp. Va'anachnu machshim v'chichinu ad or boker. Right? If we wait until the morning to essentially tell people that that this exists, right? Tell the Jews that they're safe. So what are they going to do? They're going to realize that we've done something wrong, right? Because we got here first. Or what are you doing? You're not allowed to go into the enemy's camp. Umatzanu avon. We're going to be punished for it. So again, they're saying, well, if we do this, we're going to die. If we do that, we're going to die. So, well, we should go and tell the king. But they say, before we do that, let's take for ourselves. So essentially what they do in verse 8 is justified in verse 9. That they go to the camp and take things for themselves. So again, this fits perfectly into the Gehazi, which is that he's all about the money. All he wants is the items, is the jewels, is the gold, is the silver. And he doesn't want people to know that he took it, because if he takes it and people see them carrying all the items, they're going to get punished for it. So that's why the army left it behind, but it's them, the 4 Mitzoraim, who then hide it so people don't know they took it. Who else hides something from a city or from a camp? Very famously, in the very beginning of Nach. Achan. Remember the story with Yehoshua? So they're not allowed to take anything from Ai, Yericho, right? During those battles, everything has to be haram to Hashem. And what do? What does he do? He takes it and he hides it under his tent. So essentially, they're doing something very similar, which is that they're taking and they're hiding as well. And again, he's also considered somebody who's punished quite gravely as well, right? And people die because of his sin. So again, these people took themselves out of the Jewish people. The Jews are the ones who are supposed to be, all of Israel is supposed to be getting the jewels, the riches from this encampment, but they wanted to take their slice before everyone else. So again, here we see essentially who's probably Gehazi doing something once more that is totally inappropriate and not proper for somebody to do. And what happens at the end of the story? How does the story end? So these 4 Mitzoraim kind of still linger around, but how does the story end? I'm just going to jump down here. Eventually, they go to the city and say, go check it out. Nobody believes them. They do. They check it out. Everyone realizes it's a day of jubilation for the Jewish people. Aram has fled. What happens at the end? Remember the Shalish, the captain who didn't believe that that eventually the Jews would be enriched? So what happens? Everyone from the city, all the Jews, run to the camp to go and pick up all the jewels and the money and the goats and the donkey. They go to take it. And on their way out, a tragedy takes place, essentially, which is that they trample the Shalish. That's what Elisha said. The king appointed the person, and he then gets trampled on his way out. Meaning, people are leaving the city and he gets trampled upon, which is kind of interesting because he's the one who didn't believe that it would happen in the first place. And the proof is in the pudding, because he goes out to see what's going on, and everyone's running out of the city to get the money and to get all the gold that he said wouldn't happen, and he dies as a result. So essentially, he's a victim of Black Friday shopping right after this takes place. Right, he's trampled at that very moment. Once again, this story is highlighting that even the lowest people in society can bring good tidings, can be a positive influence on the society to an extent, right? Because now you have 4 Mitzoraim who are the lowest people in society, and they're the ones who bring redemption, tell everyone about it, but they're flawed. So redemption can sometimes take place in mysterious ways. I don't think this story is trying to tell us that these 4 Mitzoraim are now the heroes of the story, because I don't think they really are. Right? They do inappropriate things in the beginning of the story, they're Mitzoraim, and they end the story not on some like high level. But again, it's just trying to show us and to inculcate within us this notion that even the lowliest in society, even the degenerates, and whoever you want to think of as the lowest, can often kind of surprise the way in which we think about how society works. Society is not a clear hierarchical structure, because today you could be poor and tomorrow you're rich, right? That's the story, essentially. The Jewish people were impoverished, and then the next day they became enriched. So all these stories kind of do highlight societal, sociological differences. Sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes even though they help, they're seen in a negative light. But all of these essentially have one thing in common as well, which is that these are miracles of the prophet Elisha. Yeshayahu will famously tell us that the Mitzoraim will eventually, good things can come from them too. Maybe we'll save that for Shir one day on Yeshayahu. But essentially, all these stories are teaching us that it's not as clear as we thought it was when we started the story. Everything changes during these stories, and it's often the characters we least think have the ability to engage in a deep way with God and with the broader kind of monarchies and governments, but nevertheless, they often hold the key to power as well. Now I'll open it up for any questions or comments, as we've now finished kind of 3 major stories in Elisha. Next week, we'll pick up and do essentially the next number of chapters on Elisha's life.
We know who the king was, because it doesn't bother to mention his name, so we have no sense of what the people were like. Were they God-fearing? Were they?
Yeah. So next week I'm going to touch upon that a little bit, because next week we're going to have even more stories where there's a king. It doesn't tell us who it is. So I'm gonna hold off on answering that directly, but it would seem like it was not a good king during much of this.
No, the fact that people ran to plunder all the enemy stuff tells you that the atmosphere wasn't great.
Yeah. Any other questions, suggestions, comments?
A lot to digest.
Just a question about the next reading.
Yeah.
We're through 7. So the next week, we're going to do 8 through 10, is it?
8 through 11, I believe. I believe it's 8 through 11.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Thank you very much.
Those will be more chapters about essentially Elisha, and that will be the end of Elisha over there.
Elijah has a bigger impact in our history and our culture, but it looks like Elisha was a greater prophet. Is that true?
I can say that.
So I would definitely agree with the first half of your statement, which is to say that Eliyahu has a much greater impact on Judaism. Further, we have Eliyahu comes up quite often through Chazal, through our rituals. Elisha does not. And that also could reflect the fact that Eliyahu did miracles on grand levels, and Elisha was much more kind of like individualized. So he worked with people and on a small level, but not Eliyahu. I wouldn't say greater. I would just say they were very different. Right? Eliyahu is the zealous one. Elisha is the kind one. Elisha Elisha does things behind the scenes. That's why he always has Gehazi do things. They were just different. So I wouldn't use the greatness, but definitely Eliyahu has a significantly greater influence on subsequent generations.
Thank you.
But Elisha was a longer prophet. He was a prophet for more years than Eliyahu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rabbi Buechler. Great session.
All right.
Look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.